Australia's most elite soldiers were trained to operate in silence, to move through darkness without fear, kill with precision, and survive where ordinary soldiers couldn't. For years, Australians saw them as untouchable, the best warriors the country had ever produced. Calm under pressure, ruthless when necessary. Men willing to disappear into violent places so the rest of the country could sleep peacefully at night. And for a long time, nobody questioned them. Australia celebrated them, admired them, protected them. The image of the SAS became tied to national identity itself. Strength, discipline, courage, professionalism, sacrifice. But somewhere inside the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan, behind compound walls and classified reports, something allegedly began changing. At first, it was only rumors, quiet conversations, stories soldiers allegedly told each other after deployments, stories journalists struggled to verify, stories people didn't want to believe, because believing them meant confronting something deeply uncomfortable, that elite soldiers, men celebrated as heroes, may have crossed moral lines in ways Australia never expected. Not in one chaotic moment, not in one accidental shooting, but potentially through a broader culture shaped slowly over years of war, secrecy, exhaustion, violence, and isolation. And once those allegations emerged publicly, Australia faced a terrifying question it still hasn't fully answered. What happens when the country's most trusted warriors allegedly stop believing the rules apply to them? Because the story of Australia's involvement in Afghanistan is not simply about combat. It's about psychological deterioration, power without sufficient oversight, brotherhood becoming silence, trauma becoming identity, and a nation discovering that wars fought far away can eventually poison institutions back home. The Afghanistan War began after the September 11th attacks in 2001, when the United States launched military operations against al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that had provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden. Like many Western allies, Australia joined quickly. The political messaging felt morally straightforward. Destroy terrorist networks, prevent another catastrophic attack, support allied nations, defeat extremism. Initially, many Australians supported the mission. There was fear after 9/11, fear of terrorism, fear that instability would spread further if countries like Australia did not participate. But Afghanistan quickly became something far more complicated than the public had been promised. The war dragged on. Objectives shifted constantly. Enemy forces adapted. Insurgents disappeared into villages and mountains. Civilian casualties complicated military operations. Local corruption weakened trust. The battlefield became morally chaotic. And through all of this, Australian Special Forces became increasingly central to the mission. The SAS were not conventional soldiers operating in large formations. They specialized in high-risk operations, night raids, reconnaissance missions, counterinsurgency operations, targeted killings, capturing suspected insurgents, and operating deep inside hostile territory with minimal support. The work demanded aggression, precision, and emotional control, but it also demanded something psychologically dangerous, the ability to normalize violence. Because warfare cannot function without emotional compartmentalization. Soldiers cannot survive combat if every death destroys them psychologically in the moment. Military training teaches controlled detachment, discipline, efficiency, and focus under pressure. But over long enough periods of war, especially wars involving repeated deployments and unclear moral boundaries, that detachment can allegedly evolve into something darker. And Afghanistan lasted 20 years. That detail matters more than many people realize. This was not a short conflict with clear victories and endings. It became a generational war, a conflict where soldiers repeatedly rotated through extreme violence with little time to psychologically recover before returning again. Operators deployed multiple times. Some spent years psychologically trapped between combat environments and civilian life. They would leave Afghanistan carrying adrenaline, trauma, aggression, grief, and hypervigilance, then return home briefly before being sent back into violence once more. Over time, many veterans described feeling emotionally disconnected from ordinary society, disconnected from civilians, disconnected from family life, disconnected from the normal moral frameworks that govern peaceful environments. Because Afghanistan was not peaceful. Every patrol carried risk. Every doorway carried risk. Every interaction with civilians carried uncertainty. An innocent-looking motorbike rider could be carrying explosives. A child could unknowingly reveal troop positions. A local villager smiling during the day could allegedly support insurgents at night. Trust became almost impossible, and environments without trust are psychologically corrosive. The enemy was often invisible. There were no stable front lines, no certainty, no guaranteed safety. Only tension, exhaustion, fear, and violence. Again and again. Meanwhile, back in Australia, much of the public slowly stopped paying attention altogether. That may be one of the most important parts of this story. The war continued in the background of ordinary life. Politicians made speeches, flags appeared during ceremonies, news coverage occasionally spiked after casualties. But for most Australians, Afghanistan slowly faded into abstraction. The country stopped emotionally engaging with the reality of what was happening overseas. Yet the soldiers kept deploying, kept fighting, kept adapting psychologically to survive environments civilians barely thought about anymore. Inside elite military culture, pressure builds differently. The SAS operated within an institution built on exceptionalism. Selection alone created psychological separation from ordinary soldiers. Passing SAS selection meant surviving brutal physical and mental testing. Most candidates failed. The process deliberately stripped away weakness, comfort, hesitation, and emotion. Men who passed were taught they belonged to an elite brotherhood. That identity matters enormously, because elite military units depend on trust, stronger than fear. Operators trust each other with their lives. That bond creates loyalty beyond ordinary friendship. But loyalty can become dangerous when combined with secrecy and trauma. Because the stronger the bond becomes, the harder it allegedly becomes to challenge misconduct inside the group. Especially during war. Especially inside highly secretive units. Especially when survival depends on cohesion. According to later allegations and investigative findings, this environment allegedly contributed to a culture where some younger soldiers felt unable to question certain behaviors. That is one of the darkest allegations within the entire story. Not simply that unlawful killings allegedly occurred, but that silence may have protected them. Because silence inside elite military culture is complicated. Sometimes silence protects operational security. Sometimes silence protects trauma survivors. Sometimes silence protects loyalty. But sometimes silence allegedly protects misconduct. And distinguishing between those forms of silence becomes incredibly difficult once war distorts moral boundaries. For years, rumors reportedly circulated quietly inside military circles. Stories about detainees, stories about suspicious deaths, stories about weapons allegedly planted beside bodies to justify killings, stories about younger operators allegedly being pressured into participation or silence. Most Australians never heard these stories, or if they did, they dismissed them. Because the mythology surrounding special forces was too strong. Australians wanted heroes, and wars depend heavily on heroic narratives. Governments need public support. Military institutions need legitimacy. Societies prefer clean stories about courage and sacrifice. The reality of counterinsurgency warfare is rarely clean. Afghanistan was filled with ambiguity. Operators entered compounds at night, not always knowing exactly who was inside. Intelligence could be unreliable. Local informants sometimes lied for personal reasons. Enemy fighters blended into civilian populations. The psychological pressure created by these conditions became immense. Every mistake could kill innocent people. Every hesitation could kill fellow soldiers. And over enough time, some veterans later described becoming emotionally numb to violence altogether. That emotional numbing is not unique to Australian forces. Military psychologists have studied similar patterns across multiple wars throughout history: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Long-term exposure to violence changes the brain. Hypervigilance becomes normal, aggression becomes easier to access, empathy can reportedly become compartmentalized as a survival mechanism. And when soldiers repeatedly operate inside systems rewarding aggression and operational success, moral erosion can allegedly occur gradually rather than suddenly. Not because soldiers wake up evil one morning, but because war reshapes perception slowly. That possibility sits at the center of Australia's Afghanistan controversy. Were these isolated incidents committed by a handful of individuals, or did prolonged warfare create conditions where moral collapse became increasingly likely? Australia struggled to answer that question because the stakes were enormous. Questioning elite soldiers meant questioning the war itself, military leadership, government oversight, and national identity. Then came the Brereton Inquiry. In 2016, the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force launched a major investigation into allegations involving Australian Special Forces operations in Afghanistan. The inquiry would take years. Investigators reviewed operational reports, testimony, photographs, mission records, and witness accounts from soldiers themselves. Not enemy propaganda, not Taliban sources, Australian personnel, Australian witnesses, Australian evidence. When the report's findings eventually became public in 2020, the impact was devastating. The inquiry found credible information suggesting some Australian Special Forces personnel were allegedly involved in unlawful killings during the Afghanistan war. The report described allegations involving prisoners and civilians. It described a culture allegedly shaped by secrecy, excessive warrior mentality, and internal pressure. The findings shocked many Australians because they directly challenged the national mythology surrounding the SAS. Suddenly, the country was confronted with a terrifying contradiction. How could elite soldiers simultaneously be capable of extraordinary bravery and alleged criminal brutality? That contradiction disturbed people because humans prefer simple moral categories: heroes, villains, good, evil. War rarely allows such simplicity, especially modern counterinsurgency warfare, because Afghanistan psychologically damaged almost everyone involved. Australian veterans returned carrying PTSD, depression, addiction struggles, emotional isolation, and survivor's guilt. Some veterans later reported difficulty reconnecting with ordinary civilian life entirely. Meanwhile, Afghan civilians also carried trauma. Families lost fathers. Children grew up around explosions and raids. Villages became trapped between insurgent violence and foreign military operations. The public discussion in Australia often reduced Afghanistan into military strategy and politics. But for people living there, the war was daily survival. And somewhere inside that collision between elite military culture, endless deployments, nationalism, trauma, secrecy, and violence, something allegedly broke. One of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the allegations involved the idea of blooding younger soldiers. Claims emerged suggesting some junior operators were allegedly encouraged or pressured into participating in unlawful killings as a form of initiation or psychological conditioning. Those allegations horrified the Australian public because they suggested something beyond isolated battlefield misconduct. They suggested potential cultural corruption, a system allegedly teaching violence as identity. Whether every allegation proves accurate in court remains legally important, but culturally, the damage had already been done. Public trust fractured, the image of the flawless warrior collapsed, and suddenly Australians began asking questions they had avoided for years. How much did commanders know? Did political leaders ignore warning signs? Did military institutions protect reputations over accountability? Were whistleblowers punished while misconduct remained hidden? Because whistleblowers became another major fault line in the story. Some soldiers reportedly tried raising concerns internally. Some journalists pursued allegations despite institutional resistance. And when information finally reached the public, reactions became deeply polarized. Some Australians believed accountability was essential. Others believed veterans were being unfairly targeted after years of sacrifice. Many feared the actions of a few would permanently stain an entire generation of soldiers who served honorably. That fear still exists today, because thousands of Australians served in Afghanistan without allegations of misconduct. Many genuinely protected civilians. Many acted professionally under impossible conditions. Many lost friends and returned home traumatized. Yet public attention increasingly focused on allegations surrounding elite units. For some veterans, that felt like betrayal. They believed politicians and society enthusiastically supported the war while soldiers fought, then abandoned them once public opinion shifted. That perception created enormous resentment, and maybe that resentment reveals another uncomfortable truth. Modern societies often romanticize war while remaining emotionally disconnected from its actual consequences. Politicians authorize violence. Media packages warfare into narratives. Citizens consume stories about heroism. But the people physically carrying out violence absorb psychological damage the rest of society rarely experiences directly. Then, years later, society demands moral clarity from individuals shaped inside morally chaotic environments. That doesn't excuse unlawful behavior, but it complicates simplistic judgment, and complication makes people uncomfortable. The Ben Robert Smith case intensified that discomfort further. As one of Australia's most decorated soldiers, Robert Smith symbolised the heroic mythology surrounding special forces. The defamation case became one of the most explosive legal battles in Australian history because it forced disturbing allegations into public view through witness testimony and operational accounts. Again, the issue was not merely legal, it was symbolic. If someone celebrated nationally as a war hero could face credible allegations involving unlawful conduct, then Australia's entire narrative surrounding the war became unstable. The country no longer knew who or what to believe. And perhaps that uncertainty is the real psychological core of this story. Not certainty, uncertainty. The collapse of clean narratives, the collapse of moral simplicity, the fear that warfare itself gradually destroys the very values nations claim to defend. Because elite warfare creates a paradox. Countries need soldiers capable of extreme violence, but they also expect those same soldiers to remain morally restrained under conditions specifically designed to erode restraint. Governments ask operators to kill efficiently, then expect them to transition cleanly back into civilian life afterwards. The psychological tension inside that expectation may be impossible to fully resolve, especially after 20 years of conflict. Today, investigations and legal proceedings continue. The Office of the Special Investigator continues examining allegations arising from the Afghanistan conflict. For Afghan families, the process feels painfully slow. For veterans, the investigations remain emotionally devastating. For military institutions, the scandal threatens legitimacy itself. And for Australia as a nation, the entire controversy forces a deeper reckoning with uncomfortable questions about war, power, violence, and accountability. Because perhaps the darkest part of this story is not that allegations emerged. History is filled with wartime atrocities committed by nations across the world. Perhaps the darkest part is how predictable moral erosion can become when wars continue indefinitely. When oversight weakens, when elite units become culturally isolated, when aggression becomes identity, when trauma remains untreated, when silence becomes loyalty, and when entire societies stop paying attention while violence continues overseas in their name. The Afghanistan war officially ended for Australian forces years ago, but psychologically, morally, politically, and culturally, the war never truly ended at all. It followed soldiers home, into courtrooms, into investigations, into families, into veteran communities, into public trust, into national identity. And the country is still struggling to process what Afghanistan ultimately revealed, because the story of the Australian SAS is not simply about alleged war crimes. It is about what endless warfare does to institutions, what secrecy does to accountability, what trauma does to morality, what hero worship does to public scrutiny, and what happens when nations ask human beings to operate in extreme violence for so long that the line between professionalism and psychological collapse allegedly begins to disappear altogether. That possibility terrifies people because it suggests no military institution is immune, no country is immune, no war remains morally clean forever. And maybe that is the final truth Afghanistan exposed. Wars do not simply destroy bodies, they destroy certainty. They blur morality. They fracture trust. They change people slowly enough that societies often fail to notice until the damage is already irreversible. And by the time nations finally confront what happened, the soldiers, civilians, families, and victims involved have already spent years carrying consequences nobody can fully undo anymore. Because the darkest history of the Australian SAS is not just about allegations, it's about silence. The silence inside helicopters before raids. The silence after gunfire stops. The silence in classified reports. The silence carried home by veterans who saw things they can never fully explain. And the silence of an entire country that wanted elite warriors, without confronting what endless war might eventually turn some of them into. Afghanistan forced Australia into a moral contradiction it still hasn't escaped. Can soldiers survive endless violence without psychological damage? Can elite military culture remain accountable while operating in secrecy? Can governments send men into morally chaotic environments for 20 years, then pretend surprise when some allegedly come home changed? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, was the war itself always going to create outcomes like this eventually? Because wars do not end cleanly. They echo through veterans, through families, through courtrooms, through graves, through nations still trying to decide whether they are mourning heroes, confronting crimes, or both at the same time. And maybe that uncertainty is what makes this story so disturbing. Not because it gives easy answers, but because it doesn't. The truth about Afghanistan is buried somewhere between courage and brutality, between patriotism and propaganda, between trauma and accountability, between the men who served honorably and the allegations that shattered public trust forever. Australia still doesn't fully know how to carry that contradiction. Maybe it never will. But this story is only one chapter in a much larger history. A history of hidden operations, political silence, war crimes, allegations, government secrecy, organised violence, institutional corruption, and the uncomfortable truths nations often bury beneath patriotism and myth. That is exactly why the Dark Files series exists. To investigate the stories governments sanitize, the histories buried beneath official narratives, the uncomfortable realities hidden behind institutions, power, war, crime, and national identity. If this documentary affected you, if it left you questioning what really happens behind closed doors, then the Dark Files ebook series goes even deeper. From elite military controversies and covert operations to outlaw motorcycle gangs, government scandals, organised crime, institutional corruption, and the darker side of Australian history most people never hear discussed honestly. Because sometimes the most dangerous stories are not conspiracy theories, they are the stories that actually happened. And once you start looking into them, you begin realising how much was never meant to reach the public at all. Search for Dark Files by Mac on Kindle and step into the stories buried beneath the surface.